The more centralized the government, the more the ingenuity and activity of private citizens are diminished. Alexis de Tocqueville.
During the Second World War, the advent of the atom bomb created the first major weapon of mass destruction, and the advent of nuclear weapons really shifted the whole military structure. However, in our recent politics, there's something similar going on with the social class hierarchy. The Department of Government Efficiency, commonly known as the DOGE, is not a weapon of mass destruction, but a weapon of class destruction. And in the rest of this video, I'm going to explain why this is the case and some of the critical economic and philosophical questions that have developed as a result of the momentum of the Department of Government Efficiency cutting the federal workforce. First, let's start with the economic implications of this. You're already starting to see it in the stock market with defense contractor stocks, government service contractor stocks, and even home builders that primarily are based in the DC metropolitan area and office REITs primarily in the DC metro area have fallen into severe bear markets. You're also starting to see increased listings of homes for sale in DC. However, it hasn't really affected the prices yet because these layoffs are brand new. And you're probably going to see a material increase in the DMV metro area's unemployment rate as a result of this. But those are kind of more the short-term things. I think the perspective you guys are more interested in is the class angle here, because there is a very big class implication for what is going on with the Department of Government Efficiency. And I call them a weapon of class destruction because the middle class of the United States is heavily dependent on the role of government and pseudo-government type jobs. I did a video about this time last year called "Are Middle Class Jobs Useless?" And I went into this and basically explained about how a lot of middle class jobs are not really the most productive and in a more efficient economy would not exist. And a lot of the reason why this is the case is because the bulk of middle class jobs in the economy are in government and in education and or healthcare. And given the fact that the government spends so much money on education and healthcare, whether directly through government programs or indirectly through subsidizing health insurance or subsidizing student loans or being an indirect payer of medical services, the government has its tentacles deep into these industries, and therefore really government spending is what keeps all three of them afloat. So first, let's have a definition of middle-class workers. I'm going to use for this statistic people who are employed as a single employer and make at least $50,000 a year and up to $200,000 per year. Technically, most of that is above the median income in this country, which is about $60,000 to $70,000 a year, depending on what source you refer to. However, my definition of middle class is not simply the 25th to 75th percentile. I think that's a very rudimentary and poor explanation of what the middle class is. And our politicians use that 25th to 75th percentile band because that always will include the middle 50% of the income distribution, even if the middle 50% of the income distribution aren't living what is commonly associated with a middle class standard of living. So what I use is probably something that is more reflective of what can actually generate a middle class standard of living, which is the $50,000 to $200,000 range, depending on what part of the country you live in. And if you use the census definitions of what is a government worker, healthcare worker, and or educational worker, you get a rough range of 30 to 35% of the American workforce that is involved in these type of jobs. And I have to just use approximates because there's not really a perfectly accurate measurement for all of this. Even the BLS counting is not perfectly reliable because it's subjective on what really is considered an educational job or healthcare job or a government job. However, that's not really the bulk. That underestimates the problem at 30 to 35% because we have to include contractors. So people who work for defense contractors or other forms of government contracts, like those, for example, procure the office supplies for the federal workforce, or those who provide food for the military bases. I mean, these aren't defense contractors, but they're still contractors, and there's a lot of businesses. There's over 50,000 businesses in America that has the government as their single biggest client. And we need to be fair, include them as effectively part of the government employment complex. So if you add the contractors, that 30 to 35% number goes up to 38 to 44% of Americans making $50,000 to $200,000 per year. And that's why the defense lobby is so strong, partially in this country, is because defense contractors provide a lot of middle and upper middle class jobs, particularly to places that have been hollowed out due to heavy industry in the consumer side moving to other countries or other parts of the country. The next level that we have to go into analysis is that I want to just include workers, not just people making that much, because there are a lot of retirees who are making $50,000 to $200,000 a year off of their retirement portfolios or pensions. They're not working anymore. So I don't really think they should count. And if you exclude retirees and only look at people who are currently employed that are in that income range, it's close to now about 48 to 52% of the people in that income range who are working are tied to these government industries, whether directly or through contractors. And that's a scary implication. So basically, it's about half of workers in America in the quote unquote middle class have a job that is directly tied to the government. And that's why DOGE is a weapon of class destruction, because they have meaningful cuts to the government, not just in terms of federal layoffs. Like the federal layoffs, if they get the amount of layoffs they want, that might affect at most 2% of the total aggregate middle class employment. However, what is the bigger issue is getting rid of the demand for all the suppliers that government needs, just cutting the inefficiencies, the potential fraud or just reducing having the government provide the same amount of services with less resources. Everybody who's providing products or services to the government, even in the private sector, are going to get hit by this. And if you see like a material correction in terms of government spending, let's say based on my video that I did on balancing the budget, you get an aggregate 15 to 20% cut in federal government spending. That can lead to 5% of the middle class being wiped out overnight, or maybe even high. And that's before the ripple effects of those people losing their jobs have for lower aggregate demand across the economy. If you factor that in, it could be a much greater number. You could possibly lose 25% to a third of the middle class in the most dire scenarios, really just because of the reduction of government. And what this leads to really is a fundamental question. And I'm not going to really go into my personal politics on this one side or the other, but the question really that the DOGE is exposing through actually highlighting the excess government spending and making the cuts to government spending is the role of the government supposed to be to provide public services at the most cost-efficient method of doing so, or is the government's role to be an employment program and a middle class, particularly employment program? Because those goals are effectively contradictory. If you want to have the public services that have been voted on by the people provided in the way that is the most efficient to taxpayers, that means a severe reduction in middle class jobs. And really, as by a product of that, just a elimination of the middle class possibly entirely, because a lot of the private sector jobs tend to be more skewed to the low end or to the very high end, especially with AI and robotics advancing and allowing more scale for entrepreneurs and employers to do a lot more with a lot less people. The need for the middle management or the middle income administrative professional or similar type roles is going to be heavily reduced. And so you're going to either have a lot of those stuff contracted out to contracting firms, or you'll have in-house technology solutions replace them. So the technological change, along with the political change to cut the government spending and the financial realities, which I mentioned in my Balance the Budget video that are going to be needed to do that, really puts the existence of the middle class at risk. And then on top of really that, you can have a lot of more international competition if you're going to be using contracted out services for a lot of roles that companies previously used to hire internally, which also has a downward wage pressure, particularly given how strong the US dollar is. And you can get very reasonable salaried workers in other developed countries such as Australia, the UK, Canada, and Western Europe who have English language skills and similar levels of education that will work at the fraction of the cost of an American doing the same thing, just on the difference of currency purchasing power. So there's another component to it there. I mean, if you look at the track record of Musk and what he's done with Twitter, now X, where they laid off over 75% of the labor force and were still able to keep their product intact, and arguably some people say is running better now, is become the model for a lot of technology companies and eventually for a lot of other companies that realize there's a lot of room for efficiency gains. This has already started in the private sector. If you look at basically since 2021, almost half of the job growth in America has been in education, government, or healthcare, particularly in the middle income range that we're talking about. And our Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, recently said that the private sector has been in material recession for at least the last year. That indicates to me is the private sector has embraced the DOGE level of efficiency to a certain degree because the economy still managed to grow without the increase in private sector labor force, particularly in the middle income range. And also the government is trying to paper this out by increasing their hiring and or increasing social safety net measures to mask the decline of the private sector. And I think that's what happened over the last 4 years or so. If there is this much room to cut, given because a lot of these hiring was to shore up the economy within the government, and there's a lot of room for efficiency, I'm not saying that their government's going to be able to cut 75% of the staff like X, not even close, but I think 10 to 20% of the federal workforce is attainable. And that is enough to really make a real ripple effect across the economy. You have a real risk of, again, the middle class being obviated. And so if the thing is also really goes back to my point that I talked about in our middle class jobs useless, all the inefficiencies in government and in the healthcare system and in the education system that have taxpayers pay way more taxes than they should, have people who buy health insurance pay much higher premiums than they should, or people who go get medical care have to pay way more than they should, or people paying much higher tuitions than they should for university. All of that inefficiency built into the system is essentially middle-class job employment. How else are you paying these six-figure salaries to government bureaucrats, administrators at hospitals, administrators at universities, and medical care professionals? How are these people being paid the salaries they are, and how are they able to grow at a rate that keeps up with inflation while the rest of the private sector cannot? And those inefficiencies, it's the government that is holding this up. And if you had a more efficient system in education and the government, you would result in the destruction of the middle class. And that the other element here is the healthcare system. You have the appointment of RFK Jr. to run the Department of Health and Human Services. And if you're going to be switching to a way that deregulates the FDA and or pitches a more healthy society and a lower obesity rate due to GLP drugs, that you don't need as much medical treatment later in life because you have a healthier population, then that is going to be a material decline of the middle class too. So a healthier America is probably, in a paradoxical way, bearish for the middle class because less people are going to need healthcare services that usually are for unhealthy people in their older ages. So overall, the question really for the DOGE is that, is your priority to keep the middle class, or is your priority to have the most efficient economy and the most efficient society and therefore maximize economic growth? I think economic growth would be much better with the cuts of the government. And you would also probably have lower interest rates because there'll be less credit risk of the government, and you'd have a stronger currency. And there's a lot of other benefits to doing a material shrinkage of the government in the long run, even if there is short-term pain from the cut in spending. However, those gains are not going to be evenly distributed. They're going to be the majority of the gains from this reallocation of capital are going to go to the high income taxpayers because they'll have to pay less taxes in the future due to our progressive system. They pay the bulk of taxes. And to business owners who benefit from less regulations and entrepreneurial people who can use the decline in government inefficiency as opportunities. Also, the beneficiaries will be those who are middle class in the private sector who will spend less on taxes, spend less on healthcare, and spend less on their children's education. So the private sector, middle class, and above win from a more efficient society, whereas the rest of the middle class and anybody who is connected to the government industrial complex is going to be a major loser. And given the way that our society is constructed, both of those camps are about equally weighted right now. And that's why this is such a politically contentious issue. And that's where a lot of our political lines in this country are drawn. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Doge. I'm really curious. Do you think that the government's job is to create a source of employment for people who are otherwise overeducated and underemployed? And I've talked about the revolution risk when you have too many overeducated and underemployed people. That's historically what leads to political revolutions or civil unrest or authoritarian governments rising because they have to keep down the masses. Or do you think the government should just have to rip the Band-Aid off and we need to fix our public finances? Because if we don't, then the consequences of not taking action and allowing somebody, like the equivalent of somebody on addiction, to keep their addiction until they just die one day, rather than the pains of withdrawals now. There's two different perspectives on this, and I am surprised the people I've met in my real life who, despite their superficial politics being one way or the other, often have the view on this question that is very different than what you would expect here. So I'd love to make this a more lively conversation when it comes to the Doge as a weapon of class destruction. But the bottom line is that if the Doge is successful and you see really meaningful cuts in government spending and employment, it really does jeopardize the existence of the middle class in America. Thank you for watching.